Our presenter this evening is Susan Kerns. We're happy to have her with us. She's an associate professor at Columbia College, a professor of cinema and television arts. She teaches courses in cinema studies, producing, and distribution at the graduate and undergraduate levels. She's also the co-founder and co-director of the Chicago Feminist Film Festival. She also recently authored an article, Can't I, Can't I Just Be a Filmmaker? Women's and Feminist Film Festivals Resurgence in a Post-Feminism World. This was published in the Routledge Handbook of Contemporary Feminism. And now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Susan, and she will share her screen with us.
Hi, everybody. Before I start, I want to thank everybody for inviting me here tonight. So thank you to Kate and Elaine and Cynthia and the AAUW Jane Addams branch. Let me just make sure I can share my screen here. Okay, I think that should work. I do want to say something before I begin, because as I practice this talk, I realized that in the age of COVID, I have learned to talk very, very quickly. And I think that's because I have started to compress hour and a half lectures into like 15-minute videos. So anyway, I'm going to try to keep it at a comfortable conversational pace. But if at any time I'm just like, moving very, very quickly, feel free to put a note in the chat and I will try to slow myself down. Also, please feel free to ask questions at any time. I am very interested in conversation, and I'm happy to stop at any time and ask or answer questions, or try to do my best to answer questions. I know that with this format, it's kind of a one-way conversation, but as much as it can be a multi-directional conversation, that's really what I prefer. So again, please feel free to ask your questions at any time, and I believe Cynthia is going to be monitoring those questions. So tonight we're going to be talking about women filmmakers and supporting women artists. And basically, we're going to look at some historical patterns, and this is primarily American film history that we're going to be talking about. We'll actually start with somebody who's French, but it's what I know best is Hollywood filmmaking and Hollywood cinema, so that's really mostly my comfort zone. But what you see when you start looking at the last 100, 150 years of filmmaking is that women make strides in the industry and then they get sidelined, and then they make strides and then they get sidelined, and then it happens again and again and again. So where I want to start is with some statistics from today, and then move all the way back to the silent filmmakers, and then I'll do kind of a brief overview of the studio system through the 1990s, and then we'll end back in today again. But here are some statistics from USC Annenberg's Inclusion Initiative. And I'm putting some links in here. I don't know if I'm going to be able, I am not going to be able to copy and paste those into the chat, but I can certainly put them, someplace afterwards, or after we're in the Q&A, I can go back through and copy them. But USC Annenberg's Inclusion Initiative has been doing really great work for about the past 15 years to look at the top highest grossing films and where women are falling in terms of different crew roles and inclusion in the industry at large. So in 2019, 10.7% of the top 100 highest grossing films were directed by women. And this is an all-time high for this study. And just to give you an idea of where these numbers usually fall, I've listed a few more years here. So in 2014, it was only 1.9%. In 2018, it was 4.5%. So from 2018 to 2019, there was a big jump. Obviously, COVID is going to mess everything up, so who knows what the numbers will show for 2020. But basically, this is never, it's never like we make gains and then we make gains and then we make gains and then more gains. It's always kind of back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Of the period of this study, only 7 Black women have directed one of the 100 highest grossing films at all. So there will be, throughout what we're talking about, I'll be talking primarily about white women because white women are the most studied and the most prominent in American film. But basically, anytime you see these numbers, you can just automatically assume it is much, much lower for Black women, for Asian American women, for Latinx women, or Latinx people. So it's just one of those things where 10.7% for the study this year seems like a good thing because it's an all-time high. But we also kind of need to question, why are we celebrating 11%? Before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about a couple of other roles, just to give you, again, sort of context. So screenwriters for 2019 were at 19.4% women. Again, this is an all-time high, and you can see some of the other numbers there. 7.4% was the lowest of the study in 2013. Producers were at 24.3%, another all-time high. The lowest was 18.3%. The study used to include editors and cinematographers, and now it focuses much more on on-screen representation. And it also includes casting directors and looks at composers. But when it was looking at cinematographers and editors were usually more on par with screenwriters. Cinematographers were always the lowest. So cinematographers were usually like 1 to 3%. And so that kind of indicates that it is still and has been, kind of the most difficult for women to break into that kind of technical role. Women have had higher numbers of representation as producers and producing roles. And this is something that I look at a lot as a film professor, because I feel like I see these patterns take shape very quickly in classes where directors are, usually seen as the creative vision of a film or project. And often I hear things like, oh, you're so organized, you should be the producer. And so what that does then is it kind of sidelines women into a certain kind of role where they're not necessarily the creative force behind the project. Now, that doesn't mean, obviously, that all of the producers in Hollywood are women. This is still a pretty low percentage, but it does kind of explain why it is a bit easier for women to break in as producers than directors. So back to this, why do we celebrate the fact that not even 11% of the top grossing films are directed by women, and how did we get here? And to do that, like I said, I'm going to go all the way back to silent cinema, but I guess I'll stop and ask Cynthia if we have any questions right now, or if I should just keep going.
Please continue, we have no questions.
Okay, great. So Alice Guy Blaché was one of the first women filmmakers, probably the first woman filmmaker. And she directed a film called The Cabbage Fairy in 1896. And this is likely the first narrative film. What's interesting is that she is very infrequently credited with creating the first narrative film. And so if you Google this and if you Google first narrative film, chances are good that actually Google will tell you it's The Great Train Robbery, which came out in 1903. Trip to the Moon is often cited, and that came out in 1902. And some people will tell you, including Wikipedia, that it's the Lumiere brothers' Tables Turned on the Gardener, which came out in 1895. So the Lumiere brothers were doing a lot of actualities. And so there's sort of some question about, were they narrative films or were they documentaries, that kind of thing. We don't need to get into that tonight. And truthfully, I will tell you that I'm not really even a person who's interested in firsts necessarily, because this is a period of experimentation. And so there were a lot of people in a lot of places doing a lot of things at the same time and experimenting in different ways. The reason I bring this up, and the problem, is that what happens is that in film history, women become excluded from official histories. So Wikipedia does actually mention Alice Guy Blaché, which is great. But one of the places where I go as a college teacher, professor, I actually looked at the textbooks. So we have a film history textbook that we use in the courses that I teach. It is the one that everybody at my school uses. I looked at the most current version of it and the last version of it before the last edit. And So one of 3 mentions of Alice Guy Blaché was actually removed in the edit from last time to the new version. And she's called the first female filmmaker, but the book focuses on the fact that she trained others. And I find that really interesting because they don't talk about her inventions. They don't talk about her experimentation or all the films that they made. They call her a teacher, basically. And she is somebody who obviously was incredibly influential early on. Now, I think it was a year ago. Time has no meaning anymore. So it could have been a year and a half ago at this point, 2 years ago, who knows? But the documentary Be Natural came out. And this is the untold story of Alice Guy Blaché here, as it says. So throughout this talk, I will be kind of recommending places where you can learn more about women in film history and see more films by women. And if you're interested in this at all, I really encourage you to watch this documentary. It's available streaming. And one of the things that it talks about is how even during her lifetime, Alice Guy was reading film history books and she was seeing her films be credited to other people. And she was even at times reaching out to authors and being like, hey, you know, I actually like directed this. It wasn't this other person. So it became a struggle. It became a thing that she was trying to correct during her lifetime. And but it really illustrates how, you know, how people who are in charge or become sort of the official historians do kind of get to rewrite the rules. So Lois Weber is another person I want to point out from the silent period. She was the first woman to direct a feature, and the number of films that she made rivals D.W. Griffith's. And I don't want to, you know, go off on D.W. Griffith, although I have numerous issues with him, but I use him as kind of a scapegoat because he is so widely studied and credited with so many things in terms of silent film. But interestingly, there was a point in time where Lois Weber was paid more than D.W. Griffith while she was directing. And she also is rarely mentioned in film history textbooks. In fact, she is not mentioned at all in the one I was just referring to. Also, another thing about Lois Weber and Alice Guy as well is that her films were not preserved. So there are only, you know, a few dozen of the 200 to 400 potential films that she made that you can even still see. And this is something too where film preservation was not part and parcel with, you know, the inventions of silent film, but many more of Griffith's films did survive and were kind of actively preserved right away. So this still also is from one of Lois Weber's films called Suspense, and it illustrates her groundbreaking work in split screen technology. She was also experimenting with sound. So again, it's just to give you another example of somebody who was working really widely and really successful in early silent film. And the list goes on. And so I've just listed some other people here. Some of these names I'm sure you mentioned. I'm sorry, the text is a bit smaller on the screen than I thought it was going to be. But you know, the list goes on in terms of like how many women were directing and working, producing, writing, starting studios in the silent period. And there are a couple of links here too. The Women Film Pioneers Project is just an amazing website. So if you have any interest in any of these filmmakers, learning more about them, about their work, about this period, I highly encourage you to use that resource. Also, the Domator conference is currently on, and because of COVID, it's virtual and I believe it's free. And so that's the kind of premier silent film conference in the world of academia. So if you have any interest in that, you can just Google Domator, you know, conference, and it'll take you there. Finally, this is like the big thing, the big giveaway. A couple of years ago, Kino put together this Pioneers First Women Filmmakers collection, and it has a bunch of Alice Guy Blaché films. It has a bunch of Lois Weber films. It has films by many of these women filmmakers. In fact, I think all of them. So it is just a stunning collection, and it is available. A lot of libraries bought it. So if you are a person who checks out physical media from your library, you could probably get it that way. But a lot of these are also available through library streaming services. So things like Canopy or Hoopla. if you have those through your library. But I think TCM has also, and Criterion Channel, the streaming service, they have also been running some of these as well. So they're really getting out there, and it's really trying to broaden the scope of what women know, or what anybody knows about women filmmakers in the silent period. So Cynthia, questions or comments?
Yes, yes. How long have they been doing the study?
I think it's been 15 years now. When they started, they had some information from the 1990s, because people were looking at these numbers in the 1990s, but it was kind of inconsistent. So it was only like they would do it. I think they did it 2 or 3 years in a row, and then they didn't do it again. So I think this cycle of the study I think they've been doing it for 15 years. And if you look back at the 90s numbers too, they're right around in the same range, like usually single-digit numbers. Are there other questions, or was that it? Okay, I'll keep talking then. I can see something pop up in my screen. I can't tell if it's people asking questions or not. So trying to be respectful.
No more questions.
Sure.
I tried to send your link that I copied from your slide, and it doesn't work.
Okay,
So
what I'll
that was
do.
Annenberg USC one, so. Sorry.
Yeah, what I'll do is at the end, when I can copy from my own screen, I'll try to go through and put some of these in the chat. So, yeah.
We have one other question that's not in the chat. What drew you to women filmmakers?
Well, I'll tell you, I had taken a number of film courses in college, and just, I think like many people, just sort of didn't think women really entered the picture until, maybe the 70s, maybe the 80s. And I was in a film history class, and our professor showed us a film by Lois Weber called Where Are My Children? And it's weird. It is a weird film. It is about birth control. And I watched it, and I was like, I just want to see more of her work, and I want to know more about this filmmaker, and try to figure out like where she fit into everything that I felt like I knew about film history, because not knowing that she even existed kind of made me realize that I was only getting a slice of what was out there. And it was those kinds of discoveries then that happened kind of over and over and over. So in fact, well, okay, in this slide, how does this relate to date? We'll get there in a second. Dorothy Arzner, who is behind me in my image and who I'll talk about momentarily, she was kind of another discovery. It was really late in my film education where somebody was like, oh, have you seen any of Dorothy Arzner's films? And I was like, I have never heard of her. So then to learn that she was really the only woman directing during the studio system in Hollywood, it was again eye-opening. And every time I learn about somebody like that, it makes me realize that there's probably another person out there I haven't heard about. And if there's another person, there's probably another person. And so it's just a matter of like, continuing to get interested in these films, in these women, in this history, and then to try to help other people. From my perspective, I like to get other people interested in it too. In part because I get excited about it, but also in part because it takes a lot of people getting excited about it in order, for example, a collection like this to get the funding to restore all these films, to bring them, to a collection, and then to make it widely available. So. Yeah. I also, I'm realizing already my voice is getting scratchy. Another byproduct of COVID, since I'm not teaching in person very often, I don't often talk for long stretches. So we'll see how that goes. All right, so how does this relate to today? So again, in the silent era, there was a lot of room for women to make their own place in the industry because the industry hadn't really been established yet. Everything was up for grabs. And so that meant that women could direct and they could be experimental with, sound technologies and split screens, and they could figure out how to use the cameras, and they were using the cameras. And so basically, they were finding their own place depending on what they wanted to do and depending on, the technology they had available to them. But they were really making a lot of work because they could. Now, what happens is that the studio system starts to get established, and then as it's sort of systemically established, the women are sort of systemically pushed out. And this is a pattern that we see throughout film history. So when there are moments where Hollywood isn't quite sure what's going on, or things, again, maybe seem a little bit more unstable, that's when women seem to be able to kind of, make inroads a little bit, because Hollywood loosens up a little bit and they aren't quite so structured. So as soon as the structures go back into place, it becomes a little bit more difficult for women to kind of have the freedom of experimentation again. But the other things I've been talking about, obviously, are how women get pushed out of film history, how lack of preservation of women's films becomes an increasing problem as the industry gets larger and larger. And then, the mention in film history textbooks, obviously film critics are a big part of this too. So as we know, most of the film critics are white male film critics. And as those critics, those writers, those professors are kind of establishing film history, for the first 40 to 100 years, this idea of what is great becomes established too. And a lot of times that idea of greatness excludes everybody except white men. And so this becomes an increasingly difficult conversation to change, because as it continues to happen, people start to think that like standards of excellence are unbiased, that it's just like, oh no, these are just the ways that you make great movies, and these are the aesthetic preferences that mean it's good. It doesn't mean that it's the aesthetic preferences that happen to be the aesthetic preferences of specific white male film critics that happen to have access to, audiences and the ability to publish books and things like that. So basically, we are still trying to kind of dismantle a lot of that language and a lot of those ideas of greatness, and not necessarily dismantle the standards, but just to understand that that is one set of standards, or those are, one set of artistic or aesthetic preferences, but that just happens to be one set, that there are many other possibilities and things that people can enjoy, and ways in which film can engage audiences. So this leads us to the Hollywood studio system, where a couple other patterns emerge. And this is Dorothy Arzner. This is not her, obviously. This is still from Dance Girl Dance. But Dorothy Arzner was a writer, editor, and director, and she worked from the late 1920s until the early 1940s. And again, she was really the only woman working in the studio system. Before I get to the next person, Cynthia, are there any questions or anything?
Yes, we have one question. Did Lois Weber do comedy too? Unfortunately, the participant had not heard of her. She had heard of someone such as Harold Lloyd.
Yeah, Harold Lloyd's amazing. But Lois Weber was certainly not doing the kind of comedy that Harold Lloyd was. He was, much more in the vein of like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton. Lois Weber did do some comedies. Alice Guy actually was kind of more invested in comedy, but I'm going to be honest, I have not seen all of their work either. So it's possible that there are films that she directed that that are unavailable, that I don't know about, that she was doing comedy. But they were doing a lot of like women's issue films, and yeah, I guess they did do comedies too. So, but it wasn't slapsticky like a Harold Lloyd, who is great. So. All right. So next, okay. Next up is Ida Lupino. And she was an actress before she was a director, and she worked in film starting in the late 1940s, and she moves to television. She moves to directing television in the 50s and 60s. And the reason that I bring her up is again, she's kind of a bridge from this earlier period of cinema to more contemporary cinema. But her excuse me, her career is also indicative of two trends for women filmmakers that continue. One is that whenever independent filmmakers, or sorry, independent pictures spring up in a real way, it makes more room for women directors. And so in the 1950s and 60s, studios started making much bigger budget films. And there were other industrial factors that I'm not really going to get into here. But what this meant was that they could no longer film theaters with the amount of content that they needed. So, so the studios were making really expensive films, but making fewer of them. And so what that meant is that the theaters needed more films just to fill their theaters, to keep, keep butts in seats, as it were. And this also helped make room for lower budget productions and also new genres and new kinds of audiences. So Ida Lupino directed what were called B movies. And in fact, sometimes people call her the queen of the Bs, because that was a place where she could find work as a director. And some of her films are great. They're much more widely available than they used to be. But basically it gave her the opportunity to get in there and to direct in that kind of, that specific, not only budgetary area, but also that genre. She did kind of film noir. So that doesn't mean that there were tons of films directed by women at this point, or even, moving into the 60s and 70s, but Hollywood did start to loosen up, and as that happened, and obviously other things were happening culturally as well, more and more women were getting into film in the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, 80s, and on. So the other thing that happens is that she moves into television after she's been working in film. And this is another pattern that we see that happens to women. Basically, they get the opportunity to direct a few films, and then if you're looking at their career kind of in a trajectory, all of a sudden you'll see there's like this television show and this television show and this television show. Now, more women now, are moving back and forth. And obviously things are changing now too, because television is really esteemed right now, and things like streaming services are changing a lot of that. But one of the reasons that people felt comfortable having women direct television during this period was it was seen as lower prestige. It was lower budgets. Directors are often not sort of the creative vision or the creative force behind television shows. The producers are seen as that creative vision. And so the director can kind of step in and step out. So it's seen as a lower risk area. And also there were genres that people felt like women were better for. So a lot of women directed in soap operas, or even movies of the week, where they were still directing full movies, but they were made for TV movies. And so again, lower budgets, this idea that they would have like a lower stakes audience, that kind of thing. And so again, you see these two patterns in Ida Lupino that carry over for really decades to come. One that she makes her in during a period when more independent films are being produced. And the other is that at some point pretty early after she's directed a few films, then she moves into television and directing television. Okay, so before I get back to today, then I'll talk a little bit more about, I'm not going to get into I'm not going to go decade by decade, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, but we see a lot of this reemerge in the 1990s. So there were women making films and women going to film school, throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, obviously, but it really becomes in the 1990s when sort of the Sundance films start to really emerge in a big way. That's another time when women filmmakers, and all kinds of them, start to, their films are produced, they screen at Sundance, they got theatrical releases at the time, there was a box office draw for these low to mid-level budget films, and so they were really successful during that period. And what's interesting about, somebody had asked if, about the studies, and I mentioned that there were studies in the 90s. There was so much optimism in the 1990s, and people were writing these think pieces like, the problem is solved, women filmmakers have arrived, everything is going to be better now. And just really thinking that we had kind of moved away from the underrepresentation of women as directors in Hollywood films or in American films. And it just didn't happen. So in the 2000s then, we really go back to a place where we're kind of oscillating between like 1 to 2% of films being directed by women to, I think at the high end in the 90s was like 7 or 8%. And again, it's just sort of cyclical over and over and over. All right, Cynthia, any questions?
Yes, I have a couple. So the film image on the last silent movie slide, was it during the suffrage era? Susan, did you hear?
I did, yeah.
You're thinking.
Yeah, I was just going back to which slide it was. So I think she's talking about this. So yeah, so Lois Weber, yes, she would have been working during that period for sure, yeah.
And then what TV shows did Ida Lupina produce or direct?
Oh boy. I'll have to look that up because I can tell you the movies, The Bigamist and The Hitchhiker are where I would encourage people to start. But truthfully, I didn't even think to list the names of the TV shows. That's, do you want me to look it up real quick?
Those are all the questions I have right now.
Okay. So hang on just a second. Now I have to answer it. She acted for a very long time. All right, so she did, this is why. So she did an episode of Daniel Boone, an episode of The Virginian, a couple of episodes of Gilligan's Island, an episode of Honey West, an episode of Karen, Mr. Novak, she did 3 episodes of The Rogues, an episode of Bewitched, an episode of The Twilight Zone. There are many more. But 3 episodes of The Fugitive, which makes a lot of sense actually, 3 episodes of The Untouchables. She was a cool lady because she really did have this connection to film noir. But I am admittedly less familiar with her television work than her film work. All right. So moving back to today, we have the 10 highest grossing films directed by women. So I pulled these because I'm always curious about how these change. I do this talk, interestingly, about once every 5 years. And so it gives me a good opportunity to kind of update information and update my thinking about things, see what's changed, all of that. So I'm not going to go through all of these. I won't read them, name by name. But what I found interesting this time, and they're listed in order. So Frozen 2 is the highest grossing film directed by a woman to date, or, again, a Hollywood film. But one of the things that really struck me this time that I had not noticed before is all of the co-directed films. So basically, I think it's 6 of these are co-directed by a woman and, either a woman and a man, or by the Wachowskis. So this is really, really interesting to me because film is thought of as such a hierarchical medium that I just wasn't expecting this. And I would guarantee, like I am not a betting person, but if anybody wanted to put money, I would guarantee that the highest grossing films directed by men I would bet 9 out of 10 of them are single directors, solo directors. So again, I think it's neat, actually. I think it's cool that women are seeing this as an opportunity to work with somebody else or split up, the creative involvement or however they're approaching it. But I was really, again, kind of struck by this list and this fact this time around. But what you'll see if you look at this, and if you then were to look at like the next 5 to 10 on this list, is that certain genres emerge. And so obviously more recently we have female superhero movies, or the superhero movies about the women characters, are being directed by women or co-directed by women. So you'll see Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman in there. This year, actually, Birds of Prey came out. That was also a DC film directed by a woman. I thought it was great. I loved it. So that's a genre that's kind of, newly into this list, emerging into this list. Obviously, a lot of children's films, animated films. And this is something that used to be primarily animated children's films. And so we can kind of speculate why it is that Hollywood thinks, that women are good directors for kids' films. And I'm not saying that women aren't good directors of kids' films, but one of the things that I find fascinating when I look at things is that, again, if I'm looking at patterns, when I look at women directors, a lot of times it'll be like, they made this cool movie and this cool movie and this cool movie and this cool movie, and then they made a kids' film. And it doesn't make any sense. You're like, well, why would they think about this person for this random kids movie? And instead of thinking about like thematically how their body of work has been developing. And it's just a place where women have been able to find work, is that they'll do a children's film from time to time. Now, obviously, movies like Frozen, Frozen 2 are incredibly profitable. So it's not, it's not a bad way to make your living. But I do think it's something, worth noting, worth thinking about if we're thinking about what kinds of creative opportunities women are getting. And then if you kept going, you would see more like romance films, romantic comedies. There aren't that many here, but it is something that, if you get into the next 10, it's many, many more of those. So it's still in keeping with this idea that people think women can direct certain kinds of films, and they're not necessarily thinking about women for other kinds of films all the time. So again, women still kind of get relegated to certain genres. But Disney is currently the best studio in terms of hiring women for their big budget film projects. The other studios, there are lists of these too, if you ever want to Google it, where it'll show like certain studios don't have anything on their slate directed by a woman for like years in a row. But Disney is consistently kind of now getting into the practice of hiring women as directors or co-directors. And, again, again, not bad work if you can get it. So that seems positive to me. Another thing about today is that in 2020, Catherine Bigelow won the Oscar for Best Director for The Hurt Locker. And I kind of skip over like the 2000s because I think, there's not a lot. It's not that nobody was directing. There were some women, but they didn't have this big moment like they did in the 1990s. It wasn't until 2010 when Catherine Bigelow won that people were like, this is it. This is the game changer. Now people are going to know that like women directors can do this. This is a war movie. It's an action movie. She's somebody who directs action movies. Like this is going to open a lot of doors. And it didn't. And it's, I remember actually students were interviewing me for papers and things like that at the time. They're like, no, but don't you think this is going to make everything's going to change now? And I was like, I just don't think it's going to matter. And ultimately, it really kind of didn't. What's interesting to me is that what it took was allegations against Harvey Weinstein. So in 2017, the hashtag #MeToo goes viral. Obviously, women all over the industry are talking about, and not just the Hollywood industry, but like all kinds of industries, right? Talking about times they had been sexually harassed, sexually assaulted, in the context of work settings. And so this begat the Time's Up hashtag and the Time's Up organization in 2018. And basically what that organization said was like, enough, like we're done with this. We're going to start advocating for more women in film. We're going to start advocating for women in different kinds of crew roles. We're going to advocate for different stories about women. We're going to take pledges that we're going to work like the actresses, or like we're going to work with a woman director within the next 5 years. We're going to, as a showrunner, I'm going to only hire women directors for every single episode of my TV show. And so that has made a real difference in the industry in the past 2 years. And I think it's great that even as the country kind of at large has, gone a very strange direction. Hopefully we are exiting that direction very soon. But you're not seeing the same thing happening in Hollywood. Like Hollywood was not trying to like self-correct or go more conservative while this other thing was happening in the culture. Instead, they're listening. They're trying to get more people of color in key creative roles. They're trying to get more funding to women, to people of color, so that we can get different kinds of stories told, different representations on screen. I think it's all super, super exciting. So before I move on, Cynthia, is there anything in the chat?
Yeah, we have at least one question. In the list of 10 movies, Big, directed by Penny Marshall, was quite clever, and the participant was surprised it wasn't on the list.
Yeah. So Penny Marshall is a director who was doing a lot of like awesome movies in the 80s and into the 90s. And she, I think, I can't remember if Big or League of Their Own was like grossed more, but certainly both of those films are beloved. And if you look at lists of like best movies by women, you're gonna always find a Penny Marshall film on there. So, and she's interesting too. I mean, one of the things I'm not really talking about here, but she's a good indication of, is that a lot of the women who were able to continue to make movies in the 70s, 80s, 90s had a very strong connection to basically to a male filmmaker in Hollywood who could keep kind of, supporting them in one way or another. So obviously Frank Marshall was really influential in Hollywood. But if you look at it like Sofia Coppola now, people, I think, I think unjustly kind of criticize her because she is Francis Ford Coppola's daughter, as if nepotism isn't rampant in Hollywood anyway. But it is kind of an extra support network where if you are a woman, for example, Elaine May, who is, I think, just a genius, she made Ishtar and it just flopped. And a lot of times if women have a film that's a flop, they're just like, they are blackballed, like they don't get another movie. So if you're a woman filmmaker who has, who makes just a tremendous flop, if you have somebody that can go back and be in your corner and kind of, help get people back into the room with you, then that's something that helps women, or was helping women sustain their careers prior to the current period that we're in. I think Ishtar is maybe a better movie than people give it credit for. So. Other questions, Cynthia? If not, I can keep going.
There we go, not at this time.
Okay. So today there's a whole bunch of stuff happening. So obviously COVID is a giant question mark in the industry. And I'm happy to talk about any of this. I'm trying to keep my eye on the time a little bit just to be respectful of everybody's time. But again, any of these things that you have questions about or want to share thoughts about, I would be happy to hear them. Hollywood pre-COVID, as a system, was surviving on big budget movies theatrically. So kind of like what we were talking about in the 1950s, Hollywood has decided they're going to make, $100 million, $300 million movies and try to make $1 billion internationally back. And if they can have a movie or 2 or 3 like that per year, it's going to get their studio through, it's going to get their investors paid back. So it's going to keep them going for another year. What that has effectively done is kind of killed the mid-market film or the mid-range budget film, which was generally where women filmmakers were working in terms of studio pictures and theatrical releases. So there are a lot of independent films out there by women right now, but those films are generally, I would say, more like the $10 million budget level and lower, whereas the mid-level Hollywood film would have been more like a 40 to maybe $60 million film. And those really just aren't being made much anymore for, again, a theatrical release. But streaming is thriving, and the serial format is thriving. And so we're seeing a lot of women get opportunities through places like Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime. And they're getting series that are about, like, Mrs. America on Hulu, which is, you know, really kind of an interrogation almost of, like, you know, some of this, like, feminist history in relationship to Phyllis Schlafly on, you know, on the Hulu platform. We have things like Lovecraft Country, which I'll mention again in a second, but all kinds of shows and these kind of mid-range movies as well. Netflix is doing a lot of them. All of that is thriving, and it really is kind of opening up different opportunities to the kinds of creators who had been excluded from Hollywood for years. So I find all of that really, really exciting. But even beyond that, like, outsider content beyond that is thriving as well. So something like YouTube, if you ask, like, college students today what network television is, they might not be able to tell you. And in fact, most of my students can't really differentiate between, like, ABC, NBC, CBS, that kind of thing. But if you ask them what YouTube channels they watch, they can tell you, and they'll have favorite YouTube stars. And it's just really interesting, like, what you find on YouTube and how people are making careers that way as content creators. They're not telling, like, you know, feature film like stories necessarily, but I do think it fits into this whole system. And I think it's another moment or area of experimentation that is really, really exciting, depending on what kind of creator you want to be. Another thing that's both exciting and troubling is that film criticism is increasingly diverse, which I think is great, but it is also increasingly unpaid. So that becomes kind of a problem because we have so many voices out there. It is very hard for people to make a living right now as a critic. But I kind of celebrate things like Twitter. I think it's just, you know, I am active on Twitter, and then I read Twitter a lot. And it's really, I feel like it keeps me in touch with, like, when people are reacting to a film, for example, like Joker. I don't know how many of you saw Joker. It was not a film I particularly enjoyed, but I read so much criticism about it. And I thought it was really interesting that, like, the criticism I was reading of it on Twitter was very, very, very different from the criticism I was reading about it in, you know, different kinds of publications like Variety and Hollywood Reporter and things like that. And I think that having that range of voices is really, is just great. I think it's going to really help the industry and help make the industry better in different kinds of ways. Now, that said, women filmmakers still have a very hard time raising money, and they do still have a really hard time getting certain kinds of jobs. So if you are in a position to hire women filmmakers, I encourage you to do so. If you are in a position where you happen to be connected to wealth, and, like, you know, somebody who's making a movie, and you know somebody else who might be interested in funding a movie, that person would be so eternally grateful to you for opening that door, because it is fascinating. If I'm being honest, there was a project I was working on, like a project about women's issues, and when we first started to raise money for it, like, every time we met with somebody, they asked us if we had a man working on the project. And this was just a couple of years ago, and it was shocking to me, but it happened over and over and over. So there's still this interesting underlying idea that, you know, whatever it is, that women are not to be trusted with the funding, or maybe, you know, need somebody else to help make the thing work, whatever it is, it's still out there. It's still hard for women to get money for their projects. And intimacy coordinators is one more thing I wanted to just mention, because they're becoming more common on sets. And the reason they're becoming more common is to advocate for a culture of consent among cast and crew. So a lot of the things that you see with Harvey Weinstein, with Me Too, intimacy coordinators are another way to kind of help combat that before it starts, before it becomes a problem. Trying to get away from the situation where, like, people got to set, especially actresses got to set, and then were coerced into doing any number of things to, like, make the film work. So I think all of these things are really, really interesting. I just have a couple more slides here, and then we'll open it up for questions for the rest of the time. Where should you look for films directed by women, or where might I direct you? So film festivals is the first place I really want to encourage people to look. Many international films never get domestic distribution, even today. So I know the Chicago International Film Festival just ended a couple weeks ago. A lot of the films that I have seen there directed by women, I have never been able to find elsewhere because they're not being domestically distributed. And that's just part of the weird industry right now, because some of them might go to a theater like Music Box Theater, but Netflix isn't really making their money on those kinds of films, so they're not going to pick them up. Eventually, they may make their way to something like Criterion Channel, but that's not, again, it's not going to be everybody. At film festivals also, you'll see a lot of filmmakers who are just starting out. So it's a really great place if there's a film that you see that you're like, this is just amazing, and you want to, you know, maybe it's a young filmmaker, you just like email her, be like, hey, I loved your movie. That's, you know, that is going to be encouragement that that person is going to appreciate hearing. Typically, I would encourage you to attend the Chicago Feminist Film Festival. Due to COVID, we're on hiatus for the time being until we can bring back a regular festival experience. But one of the things we have done, all of our programs are free and open to the public because we want it to be an experience where you don't have to pay in advance to be able to attend a film. We want people to be able to take risks in terms of the content that they might see. So they might come to a shorts program, they might like some things and not like some things, but I think people are more interested, or maybe not interested, more willing to kind of take that risk if they didn't have to pay $20 in advance and commit to it. So we're just trying to, again, get different kinds of voices out there, different stories being told on screen. But again, libraries are a great place to go. They have a lot of physical media, but again, Canopy, Hoopla, Alexander Street, and Swank, if your libraries have them. All of these are streaming services. And if you use something like an Apple TV and you have Canopy through your library, you can download that app and then just like watch it as if you'd watch, you know, NBC or, you know, Netflix, whatever it is. But also cable and streaming services like TCM, Criterion Channel, Netflix, HBO, Amazon, Hulu, etc. There's just so much out there right now by women creators. And I listed here, I made this list very sheepishly and really on the fly. These are some directors that I'm currently excited about, but even putting them together, it's like I don't really even know why I would recommend these filmmakers over other filmmakers because everybody's tastes are so different. But anyway, it is what it is. I will say that I am dying for another Elaine May film. She had talked about directing again before the pandemic. I don't know if that will happen. I'm a little bummed that Candyman got so delayed because I'm really excited to see that. Excited about what Nia DaCosta does with that story. But otherwise, these are just some names I dropped. And then a couple of resources so that I can end here. Women Make Film on TCM is currently happening. I think this is it's maybe a month long. So Women Make Film is a 13 or 14 hour documentary about all kinds of women in the film industry. It was directed by Mark Cousins, which, you know, a lot of people feel a little weird about, but it is extensive. It's a great place to learn about more women filmmakers. You can buy the Blu-ray on Amazon for $35 or, you know, again, ask your library. But you can even Google things like the 100 greatest films directed by women, or the all-time greatest films directed by women, or the best movies of 2020 directed by women and people of color, things like that. And as you go through these lists, there's going to be stuff that, you know, I guess one of the things I like about these lists is the range of filmmakers that I encounter. So you can see like experimental, like the movie Daisies is one of my favorite movies. It's a Czech New Wave film by Vera Chytilova. And it is my favorite, probably my favorite film ever. It's just terrific and it's bonkers and it's weird and I love everything about it. And that will be on these lists. And it'll be next to something like Hustlers, which I also loved. And that'll be next to something like Agnes Varda films, or again, like Celine Sciamma films. Portrait of a Lady on Fire is amazing. So there's just all kinds of different films out there, depending on what you're interested in. And what I want people to do is just dive in, like watch a movie, like watch Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and then go through Celine Sciamma's other films. Water Lilies I watched this year. it's a film about a coming of age film that features a lot of synchronized swimming. And I just thought like synchronized swimming was like the best metaphor for girls going through puberty, because it's like trying to keep this like, you know, beautiful image on top of the water while underneath the water, like everything's going crazy. I loved it. So anything that can get you excited about films. So that's really all I have. So Cynthia, are there any other questions?
Yes, we have a few. So how can other women help to support women filmmakers and move them forward? I find it interesting that the top 10 contains so many superheroes and cartoon characters rather than hard-cutting reality like Hurt Locker.
Yeah, so I think there used to be a really great blog that was like, these are the movies coming to theaters this week directed by women, and it no longer exists. And if anybody wants to start that, I would be your first follower. I would love that. I would help you get other people to follow as well. But anytime that you can, you know, if there's a movie that you read about that's going to be in the theater, if you can see it in the theater, that is great, because they really do look at those numbers. But again, just, you know, streaming services, things like that. Film festivals, you know, a lot of film festivals now will have sort of a women in film track, which I think is really, you know, good, just to continue highlighting that stuff. And that's, a lot of that stuff is fairly recent too. You might be surprised at how recent that is. But again, if you want to, like, I mean, there are always women, you know, fundraising on Seed and Spark is kind of, it's like Kickstarter, it's a crowdfunding, and it's run by women. It's a crowdfunding platform where people are constantly trying to raise money for their films. If you know, maybe it's like every once in a while you'll throw $20 at a movie, or $100 or whatever it is you want to throw at a movie. Just even things like that. And then like telling people that you appreciate their work is a great way to keep people motivated, because filmmaking is hard, and especially independent filmmaking takes a really long time, and there are many more reasons to quit than to keep going. So even just hearing from people that you loved a movie is helpful. So I think any of these things, all of these things, whatever's in your comfort zone.
Okay. Another question is it easier for women to make a documentary film?
Well, I would say yes, sort of. So it's kind of easier to make a documentary film, because with a documentary, you know, you can, if you have a camera, you can start making a documentary. But the funding is still really difficult, and ideally you do want funding for your docs. You know, a lot of documentary filmmakers rely on grant funding and foundation funding. And so those are all very, very competitive. There are specific granting organizations, you know, for women or for people of color, but they're still incredibly competitive. So I think it's easier to start making a documentary. I'm not necessarily sure it's easier for women to complete a documentary unless they want to do it all on their own. Because again, you still get into the complications of fundraising and things like that. And even it's, you know, it's fascinating because it's like, if you have, I mean, I know men that have raised a lot of money making documentaries about women's issues, when I know women making documentaries about the same issues and can't get the funding. So it's even just fascinating when that happens. And it's not, you know, it's not that I don't want men to get their films funded, but there are times where it becomes frustrating, certainly.
Okay, and then I have, Lynn Franker says, I have worked several years as a background extra in Chicago, albeit very part-time. Most of the productions are very male-centered: Chicago Fire, Chicago Med, Chicago PD, etc. The postings she sees for jobs for the weekly shows are more for men than women, because the shows are written with mostly men as the principal characters, which reflect life in those situations. The films being done seem to use more women both as principal actors and as extras. The majority of the casting directors in Chicago are women, which she finds encouraging, but how do we get more female-centered shows to film in Chicago?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, I wish I knew. I know that obviously Chicago has a really robust film office, which I think is great. And I know that they are working all the time to bring more shows to Chicago. But to your point, one of the things that is interesting, if you look at different kinds of studies, if you have female showrunners and female writers, you're going to have more female characters. And so I don't know who's writing Chicago Fire and Chicago PD, but my guess is that those writers' rooms are probably more, male centric, which is probably why we have that situation. But yeah, it's a good question. I do know that there are people who are trying to get sort of locally produced shows off the ground, but they are a little bit lower budget, because a lot of times what you try to do is like get a show from LA to, kind of move everything to Chicago via tax credits and things like that. So yeah, it's a great question.
And
That's
then,
fun that she's been an extra.
yes. Wondered why you didn't mention Lena Wertmuller too.
Yeah. So I just grabbed a few people. There are many people that I left out of this discussion. But yeah, she's a great one too. So, and she is on, like, if you look at any of these 100 greatest films lists, like, she is on all of them as well.
Do you think it helps to have more women that have their own production companies to get more of their own work and other women into the pipeline?
I really do. I mean, women hire women, and that's the issue. As easy as that is, like, we need more people to hire more women, and I think that for some women who had broken into Hollywood in earlier eras, they sort of felt like they could maybe mentor a person or two, but in many cases, it kind of became about self-preservation. And so I don't think that women felt like they could be as generous with their support of other women as I think women can be now. So like Ava DuVernay is a great example of somebody who is hiring women left and right. She's got shows where every single showrunner and director are women. I think that's all amazing. And I do think that we're in a situation where women are really thinking about this much more. I think it's also a different conversation than, like, I definitely talk to people who work on all male or primarily male crews. And I try to tell them, like, hey, you need to be thinking about hiring more women. Like, I don't care how, I don't care where you fit them into your crew, but like this, you got a lot of dudes over there. And it's always a harder sell for some reason. There's this idea that, like, women are going to come in, and I don't know if it's like, if we're the police or we're the mother or, whatever it is, but we're somehow going to break up the party. And I don't think that, I hope that feeling is dissipating. I have heard that feeling is, that Atlanta, for example, is much younger and more diverse crews. And so if you're filming in Atlanta, that you're going to encounter that far less than if you're filming in LA. So I think that's exciting. I think that's hopeful. I would love for more female production companies to pop up in Chicago. I think that would be great.
And then, do you think a movie such as Yentl could net Barbra Streisand a Best Director Oscar today?
Man, I would hope so. I love Yentl. I do. I mean, I think she would definitely be a serious contender. Yeah.
And then the last one I have was one I asked is, what do you think the impact is going to be about film and big budget films when, because of COVID, the filmmakers are, going directly to the customers by streaming instead of the movie houses?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens, because I feel like as soon as people can get back out there again, they're going to. So I think we're going to have a few just like gigantic hits. I know that the Tenet, the Christopher Nolan film, was trying to be that film last summer. I just think it was way too early. I mean, there was no way many of us were going to go to a theater last summer. But I think once the vaccine is widespread and it really feels safe to go see movies again, I think we've got some films that are going to be massive hits. And that will probably encourage Hollywood to at least continue to do some of that. I think you brought up Mulan and how that went straight to Disney Plus with like this premium price packaging. You know, they don't release any numbers for that kind of stuff. Everybody kind of speculates that that was a disappointment for them. I do think that they will probably do more of those kinds of big budget releases for their Disney Plus platform. I'm not sure how much, or maybe it'll just be like a shorter window. So they might release it in theaters for like, I don't know, 2 weeks, and then release it on Disney Plus only after that. You know, I'm not sure, but I know that what they're thinking about is how do they keep their subscribers feeling like there's a reason to subscribe, especially with somebody like Disney Plus, who's, you know, if you don't have kids, you're unlikely to get that service unless there's content that's coming out that you really, really, really want to see. So I think that they're thinking about that. Netflix has, I believe they bought the theater in Los Angeles. So I think Netflix is going to try to figure out how to make some money theatrically. And that will, you know, obviously the Oscars are going to be weird this year too, but Netflix having and owning a theater means that they can, you know, show their films in their theater, make that money, be eligible for Oscars and not have to work with some of the other chains. So it's a way for them to, you know, to maintain control over more of that funding too. So it's really hard to say. I mean, I guess what I hope is I would love to see studios go back to kind of more mid-level content, because I feel like that is more interesting generally for me as a viewer. But I don't really think they're going to do that. And I think that, you know, Netflix is kind of trying to become like all of cable, where they have, you know, a lot of food shows, a lot of like, they sort of have the Food Network and HGTV and, you know, like teen shows and some more serious shows and some movies and now holiday movies. So they're kind of trying to be everything to everybody. I don't know how long that's going to be sustainable for them, so I'm curious to see what happens with them too. But right now, you know, there really are a lot of women getting opportunities, so I'm very happy about that.
So we're wrapping up. Any last thoughts that you want to share?
That I want to share?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. I mean, I just, you know, I really encourage people to, you know, again, like Google a couple of these lists. And yeah, I hope you find somebody new, you know, somebody new that you love, that you're like, I never knew there was a movie out there like this. That's what I hope for you. We've got, you know, probably at least a few more months of pandemic here. So maybe now is a good time to do a little exploring.
Plenty of time to watch some new movies.
Exactly. Yeah.
New to you, but available somewhere.
Yeah.
Well,
And
thank you so much, Susan. We really
definitely
covered a lot. We appreciate it.
Yeah. And